Hello again. Today I'm talking about false assumptions. I'm in Matthew 25:14 to 30. And it says this: "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. And likewise, he who had received 2 gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1 went and dug in the ground and hid the Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he went to the first who had received 5 talents and came and brought 5 other talents, saying, 'Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents besides them.' His Lord said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter in to your Lord's joy.' He also, who had received 2 talents, came and said, 'Lord, you delivered me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more besides them.' His Lord said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter in to the joy of your Lord.' Then he who had received 1 talent came and said, 'Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours.' But his Lord answered and said to him, 'You wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" Thanks be to God for his word. There has only been one true genius on this planet, and of course, it's Jesus Christ. Any other person that is said to be a genius is measured by man's standard, but Jesus is measured by God's standard. If you think of the geniuses of the world like Beethoven and Walt Disney, then you think of how many minds they have touched. Then think of Jesus, how many minds he has touched and how many minds he is still touching today. Jesus is a master and brilliant storyteller who reflected the mind of God when he was here on earth. And he spoke in parables. A parable I want to take you to today is the one about the talents. Now, I want you to make sure you caught what Jesus said. He said that he went immediately, the first servant, and put his master's money to work, as did the man with the 2 talents. But of course, the third man, who does nothing with what the master gave him. And a side note here, God gave each one of us gifts. If we don't use those gifts, we are like that third man who did nothing with what was given to him by his master. Now, who believes that this story is about money? Good. You're right. It's not about money. It's about the gifts that God gives us. And, of course, the return of Christ. Christ said, "Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me to give every man according to his work." as his work shall be. Now, please remember, to the Lord, one day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. So, for Christ, it's only been a couple of days, even though for us, it's been over 2,000 years. But that's another sermon. You would think that Jesus, representing a merciful and loving God, might have said, well, that's okay. I wasn't here to give you much instruction, so it's partially my fault. Next time, try to do better. But see, that's the genius of Christ. He flipped that story. Because in his day, that's what the people would have figured that Jesus would have said. And, of course, at the end, the unprofitable servant is thrown into outer darkness. And on that happy note, let's talk about false assumptions. Have you ever made a false assumption? And if so, what has that assumption cost you, or may even be costing you today? Think about that. Now, certain assumptions are necessary. The person that flies your airplane, he has a license and he knows what he's doing. Or the attorney that went to law school and passed the bar, and that's the important part. Or your tax person who does your income tax has been trained how to do it right. So certain assumptions are okay. The three most dangerous words in any relationship that you can speak is I just assumed. I didn't check into it. I just assumed. Those three words have destroyed more relationships and more opportunities than you can possibly imagine. Sometimes we assume how someone feels about us, and we get offended at them. And we haven't even asked them how they feel. You get angry, and then bitterness sets in, and even hatred. Someone said, assumption is the vulnerability of ignorance masked by the illusion of certainty. When you just assume, you are open to Satan's attack. That's what Jesus did so brilliantly. He confronted the assumptions of God and his kingdom. And also what it takes to be in right relationship with God. He confronted false assumptions, and they killed him for it. Assumptions always create an illusion of control. So, what makes us make false assumptions? Well, here are three components. One, apprehension. We can find ourselves scared about a situation that we're going into, so we shield ourselves from what we do not understand. We create knowledge that we have not looked into based on prejudice that possibly we have inherited. Assumption is protecting me from finding out something that might really help me understand what I am facing. Number two, apathy. Straightforwardly put, I don't care enough to find out what you did or why you did it, or what it's like to be you, or ask a question about why things aren't working right. If you assume, you don't have to be afraid to ask a question or be afraid of the answer. Number three, arrogance. And I think everybody has to see the world through the same lens as you do. Well, that's arrogance. To think everybody grew up the same as you did, that is the height of arrogance. Now, please hear this. Husbands and wives, do not assume that your mate knows that you love them. Tell them that you love them, often. Not that you love them, but that you are in love with them. There is a huge difference. And that goes for Jesus as well. Tell Jesus and tell God what they mean to you every day. Never assume that your kids are hanging around with the right people. If you're a boss, tell the people that you work with that they're doing a good job. Never assume either of these situations. Never assume that your understanding of the Bible is the correct one. Jesus is confronting assumptions the people had of what God was like. One of the sentences comes from the man with the 1 talent. He came to the master and said, "I know you were a hard man." What he is saying is he wasn't a fair man. Jesus is using this parable to describe different assumptions that people had of God. If you live by assumptions, you will have an inaccurate view of God and life in general. This man's assumption of his master is where the trouble is. In the King James Version of the Bible, it says, "I knew you were a hard man." But in the English Standard Version, it says, "I knew you to be a hard man." Now, did you catch the difference? Right there is how assumption works. This man is describing his experience with the master, not necessarily the reality of what the master is like. And that's where assumption comes in. Just a side note here. Be careful when you're reading other versions of the Bible. The King James Version is said by scholars to be the most accurate, followed by the New King James Version. I read you the same verse, but from 2 different translations, saying the same thing, yet it comes out differently. Always check it against the King James Version. Someone said when you plant an assumption in the soil of ignorance, you reap a harvest of confusion. Here it is again. When you plant the seed of assumption, I knew you to be a hard man. In the soil of ignorance, you don't know me like that. You reap a harvest of confusion, and you become a worthless servant. You're not operating on knowledge, but on assumption. And on the basis of assumption that you achieve nothing. You become unproductive, unfit, unfruitful, and you can include lazy and unfaithful as well. The reason we know that this servant had a false assumption of his master is in the verse before. He is speaking to the servant who had 2 talents. His Lord said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of the Lord." Now that doesn't sound like a tyrant to me. The lazy servant made a false assumption and used it as his guide. And he made a terrible mistake. We make the same terrible mistakes when we assume. And we can destroy other people and quite possibly ourselves. In this parable, Jesus brilliantly illustrates 3 servants, 1 master, and 2 mindsets, or if you will, thought processes. Jesus challenged the mindset of the people of that time, and he does so today to give us his mindset. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, and often open to interpretation. As I showed you earlier, you can read or hear the same thing, but have it said differently by different people. There is a parable about Revelation, the mindset. He teaches this because the people assume they know God and what he's like. but they don't. They need to be confronted with the reality of who God really is, to be confronted, to confront the wise so the simple can see what was there all along. There are 6 dangerous assumptions in this parable, and I'm going to give them to you real quick. First, the assumption of ability. In Matthew 25:15, the key is according to his ability. God gives us abilities, but it's up to us to grow them. God will help us, but we must do the work. I've heard people say, and I've said it myself, if God wants this church to grow, he will grow it. That's wrong. Of course God wants the church to grow. Jesus planted the church. The question is, are we able to grow the church? Are we willing to put in the work to accomplish what Jesus gave to us? Second, the significance of assumption. You might think the master is unfair, giving 5 to the first man, 2 to another, and 1 to the last. But the master didn't expect the same return from each of them. He expected them to do their best with what he gave them. He expected them to increase on what they have received. And this is what God wants from us, to build on the gifts that he has given you and me. 2 of the men in this story operated on the ability that they had, and they grew in their ability. The third, that hid the talent, did so out of fear. When we step out of our comfort zone, there's always going to be fear. And sometimes that fear stops us from stepping out at all. 2 of the men knew the heart of their master. The third one was operating as a slave to his assumption. Now, you might think that the master that gave the man the 1 talent didn't give him very much. So please don't miss this. 1 talent was equal to 20 years' wages of a day laborer back then. So, not such a small amount, was it? Don't think that any gift that God gave you is small and not important. Use that gift, grow that gift, and God will give you more. Number 3, the safety assumption. That's when you leave your gift buried, playing it safe instead of using it and letting the master prune it and make it flourish. There is a great danger in playing it safe. I'm not sure if you've heard this saying or not. The saying goes, use it or lose it. God's gifts work the same way. The great danger here is not that you might fail, because we all fail from time to time, but that you would be faithless. I would rather meet the Lord having tried and failed than meet the Lord being faithless. Number 4, the urgency assumption. If you don't use your gift, the gift God gives you, then you run the risk of the gift becoming unimportant and unusable. Jesus said, no one knows the hour of his return. So, if we don't put our gifts to work right away, we might not get the chance to use them. I heard someone say this: the opportunity of a lifetime must be seized in the lifetime of the opportunity. The opportunity of a lifetime must be seized in the lifetime of the opportunity. You might think you have lots of time, so you'll get around to it. But you may run out of time before you get back to it. One of Satan's greatest weapons is the lie. Don't worry, you have time. And he wields that weapon very well. Number 5, the maintenance assumption. This is where people sometimes get confused on what faithlessness is. Faithlessness is not maintaining the status quo. Faithlessness is multiplication. Faithfulness, is multiplication. What I'm about to say is a little harsh, but you need to hear it. You're not faithful to God when you give him your life. You are faithful to God when you let him use your life to bring others to the knowledge of him. Too often we sit on the gifts that God gives us. I know I did. When I was 7 years old, God wanted me to be a pastor. It only took me 49 years to listen, because I made false assumptions that God knows what I have done and the person that I had become, and he couldn't use me. I had blown my chance, I thought, but a pastor friend of mine proved my assumptions wrong, and here I am. Lastly, the entitlement assumption. Don't take for granted what God has given you. If you continually take it for granted, it will be taken away from you. You can apply this to every part of your life. A lot of marriages could have been saved if this had been applied. Don't forget where your gift comes from. Don't be like the lazy servant. Don't assume that you can use your gift in your time. It doesn't work that way. Two of the men assumed the responsibility of their talents and gave them in use for the master. The lazy servant accepted the talent, but he never assumed the responsibility for it or gave anything back to his master. Loved ones, don't make this same mistake. If you bury the gift of God, or if you have buried it, dig it up. Put it to use this very minute. Assume the responsibility to God. Thank you for hearing my message today, and please like and share this so I can send this message around the world.